We're returning today to the question of how are consumers, specifically Japanese consumers, responding to the push for and what interest do they have in sustainability. So we're joined today by James Hullo, who is the founder and CEO of Fabric, and also Nick Ashley. The talk tonight will focus on what sustainability means to Japanese consumers. And they have put together a very extensive report, which I think it really speaks to the growing awareness of sustainability, but the fact that we have a long way to go. And so with that brief introduction, I'd like to now invite you to listen to James and Nick, James Hullo and Nick Ashley. Gentlemen, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Swint, for that generous introduction. Yeah, and I was saying, I think you summarized everything really well. And so it's now my job, and mainly Nick's actually, to kind of fill in the details. Just in terms of how this is going to go, we've done a research study which threw out some really interesting data, and we decided to get that data in front of you as much as possible. We won't go too much into methodology as we would normally, but get the results in front of you first, try and prompt a really robust discussion. And then hopefully, if there are any questions around exactly what the data means, we can go into that at the end. Just quickly from me, I did start this off, and this project was something that I felt was really necessary. Obviously, there are other professionals working in this space, as you guys represent and have provided yourselves. We felt that that there was a gap to fill, and specifically, around this, the social fabric, enabling brands in the social fabric, which is our sort of cause, our mission. It's all about creating new types of connectivity. The name, I'm glad you like it. It does put us in contest with upholstery suppliers when it comes to domain. But thankfully, it's also working to kind of create the right vibe, which is definitely about sustainability, but more broadly, how companies and for-profit companies can really sort of can create a new sort of interweaving with society, stakeholders, etc. So I'm just going to set up here the goals of the study. We felt that there were three really core questions that needed to be answered that would really empower business leaders and brand leaders to make bolder decisions towards their sustainable future. The first is, what does sustainability mean to Japanese consumers, and how much do they care? Secondly, how much do Japanese consumers know or care about brands' level of sustainability? And how can brands stay competitive in their own approach to sustainability? So I'm going to start off by answering half of the first, and then I'll hand over to Nick for the rest of the first and the second, which is really meaty stuff from the data point of view. And then I'll wrap up with the third, and we'll hand over back to Swint. So what does sustainability mean to the Japanese consumers, and how do they care? So this is probably the most the first thing we really need to get in front of you in terms of the data. This graph shows the Japanese population on a scale that actually starts from -4 through to plus about 28. Basically, we created a sustainability engagement score as a composite of various responses within a survey of 5,300 Japanese consumers, representative of the consumer population 18 to 65. And as you can see, the majority at that low level, 65%. And it basically, the more sustainable you get towards the right, the fewer the number of consumers that are engaging. And that's something that probably isn't a surprise as a general shape, but it's been really valuable to see that for us in terms of the actual populations. So at this light level, the sort of mid-tone blue there's 17%. At moderate, there's 9, and high, there's 4%. So what Nick is going to unpack a little bit about what those different levels actually correspond to in terms of behavior. But what broadly it means is that when we're talking specifically about how consumers behave, their attitudes when they're shopping, to what extent sustainability is affecting their decisions. And at the lower end, it's barely making any sort of imprint on how they're thinking or decisions. At the high end, it could be a really important factor, but in some cases, the most dominant factor for a range of categories. We'll also highlight there's actually a negative engagement group with a score of between -1 and 4. They are a group who are very cynical towards sustainability. They view it as a con or some sort of scam, various sort of negative opinions within that. But it's a small number, but it's perhaps an interesting result to see there. So the left-hand bar charts show the breakdown of those groups by gender. It's quite interesting to see from that progression from low, light to moderate, the second, third, and fourth. Then the red bars are increasing in size, which shows an increase in the proportion of females in that group. And then it evens out a bit at the highest group, which is an interesting result, but it's not a massive bias either. It's quite significant, it's worth noting. If you talk to sustainability experts, people in market research, etc., in Europe or the US, they often talk about a generational effect. They highlight the high engagement from Gen Z and millennials around sustainable brands and causes. We're not seeing anything like that kind of dramatic generational effect in Japan. In fact, the engagement with sustainability isn't any higher amongst younger generations than olders. If anything, it's quite interesting that the over 65s actually tend to pick up, or sorry, the over 60s actually get larger in proportionally at higher levels. But there's not a really big sort of gender effect. Perhaps the 30-something group is interesting, and it actually gets lower. And I'm afraid we haven't got really conclusive data as to why. So I'm sure that's a question that you would have asked in terms of the generational effects. There's some interesting talking points in there, but I think I'll hand over to Nick now for the really important findings from the research.
So what I'd like to do now is share some examples from our ethnographic research, that part of the study, to illustrate what sort of people fall into these different groups. We've seen that there's low, light, moderate, and high, but what are they like? So for example, actually the point I'd like to make here is that each of these groups do something sustainable. They do take some sustainable action, but for different reasons. So when we talk to someone from the low or light engagement group, she always took an eco bag shopping with her. We actually followed her around the supermarket, and she made a point of taking this eco bag, which fits directly in the shopping basket. You've probably seen the sort. And the point here was not to save plastic. She didn't really care so much about that. She wanted to save time, because at the end of her shop, the shopping assistant would pack the goods directly into the bag. So that's typical of the low to light engagement groups. They want to save time and money. That's what's top of their mind, not sustainability. In the moderate engagement group, we had a man who had a very nice Arc'teryx jacket. It was probably quite expensive, and he wanted to repair it when it got damaged. Now, that wasn't necessarily a sustainable to be sustainable. It was because he really liked the jacket. He liked the way it looked, and he even liked the way it looked being repaired. He liked the fact of it having patches on it. So that, again, is typical of the moderate engagement group, who want to combine sustainability benefits with other benefits, such as aesthetics. And then in the high engagement group, these are people who really take extreme actions, such as brushing their teeth with toothpaste pills rather than toothpaste. This is something personally I'd never seen before. But the reason the respondent we talked to was using toothpaste pills was not because it brushes her teeth better, or because it tastes good, but because it comes in a glass jar, not a plastic tube. And these high engagement consumers care a lot about packaging and supply chain, things like that. So when we look at the shape of this curve, this is the last thing I want to say about this graph, because it's quite interesting. We can see that the center of gravity at the moment is right over on the left in the low engagement group, which is a fairly sad, but perhaps not so surprising state of affairs. What we can expect is that this center of gravity is gradually going to shift higher for various reasons. One reason is that the influencers, the early adopters in the high engagement group, are going to be advocating solutions and influencing people in the lower engagement groups to become more sustainable in their behavior. Also, brands, of course, have a certain responsibility and power and opportunity to shift this curve. And it's not just brands, of course, also government, media are going to be playing a role. But we can expect that the shape of this curve, if we keep doing this survey year after year, is going to gradually shift upwards until sustainability is really the new normal. And now it's quiz time. Just to make sure that everyone's still awake, we'd like to ask you about the SDGs. So I'm sure everybody's familiar with the SDGs here. The question is, in which areas, in which of the SDGs do major challenges remain for Japan, according to the UN? The answer is 5 areas have been identified as having major challenges remaining for Japan. That's gender equality, so everyone was right on that. Climate action, we had several 13s. Life below land, life below water, life on land, and partnership for the goals. So this was a little bit of a break, but I also wanted to introduce remind us of the SDG framework, because this is how we decided to approach it when we asked consumers about sustainability. We didn't just ask them straight out, what does sustainability mean? We showed them a list of SDGs and asked them which areas they associate with sustainability. As you see, the largest response here with 27.7% was actually none of the listed. So consumers thought none of the SDGs had anything to do with sustainability, or at least that's not what comes to mind when they heard the term sustainability. So what that suggests is that the interconnected view of sustainability presented in the SDGs hasn't really filtered down to Japanese consciousness yet. Another interesting point is that 3 out of the 5 major issues which we've just talked about didn't feature in the top 10. They featured low down on the list, under 16%. So that's protecting life on land, achieving gender equality, quite low at 13.8%, and partnership for the goals. So that means that the urgent issues aren't really recognized as urgent issues. But thirdly, the top 3 ranking SDGs, life below water, action on climate change, and clean energy for all, are all related to the environment. So that reflects our ethnographic findings and perhaps everybody's anecdotal findings that when you talk about sustainability, the first thing that comes to mind for Japanese people is eco. It's mainly about environmental sustainability, not social or economic sustainability. The next big question we wanted to address was how much the Japanese consumers know or care about what brands are doing in terms of sustainability. And again, we decided not to rely on, we didn't decide not to ask this directly, but to rely on the SDGs framework as a basis. So in other words, we simplified this time the 17 SDGs into 6 areas of sustainability. That's supporting basic living needs, promoting economic and technological development, promoting social development, achieving a more equal society, managing environmental resources, and conserving the natural world. So each of those combine several SDGs together. And what we did was ask consumers about how committed they think brands are to these different areas. What we got was a sustainability perception score. where a score of 100% would mean all the consumers who are aware of that brand believe that it's totally committed to each of the areas that I just mentioned. Now, no brand got 100%, but Toyota came in as the clear leader above all the other brands that we looked at, about 36 brands from different categories. Toyota got 20.1%, followed by Google, Apple, Uniqlo, and Aeon. And interestingly, at the other end of the scale, you can see brands that claim to be very committed to sustainability, such as Lush or L'Occitane, but are not perceived to be sustainable by the general public. And when we break this down further across the 6 sustainability areas, the picture becomes a bit clearer. So what we see here is that each brand has its signature strengths. It's very unusual for a brand to score well across all 6 areas. But some brands lead in only 1 or 2 dimensions. So I'd like to look at Toyota, Patagonia, and Suntory as examples. Toyota is really a national brand. In many surveys, it comes out as the most popular brand in Japan. So this status as the national brand, plus the fact that it's recently repositioned itself not as an auto company, but as a mobility company, gives it an advantage in the broad area of social and economic development. Suntory has a strong corporate messaging, Mizu to Ikiru, living with water. And that communicates its strengths in conserving the natural world and managing environmental resources, which is where it excels on those 6 areas. And as it happens, Patagonia, which is well known amongst its peers and amongst many consumers as well as a sustainable company, is recognized particularly for conserving the natural world and managing environmental resources, so that its efforts in conservation are recognized as such. So in other words, you don't have to excel in all areas. You can find your niche, find your signature strengths and build on them.
Thanks, Nick. So we've covered there the first 2 questions. The first one around how engaged are consumers with sustainability, how much they care about brands and their commitments to sustainability. And the third part of the report was around how brands can stay competitive in their own approach to sustainability. And that sort of brings the 2 sides of that sort of ecosystem, if you like, the consumers and the brands that was the focus of the study together. We interviewed around 15 leaders of both Japanese, international Japanese and international companies in Japan. And as an overview, we didn't find that every single one of them were feeling all of these pressures, but we certainly, I think most of them were feeling more than half of them. You'd probably, a lot of the professionals on this call would recognize these, but just to play them back, they felt regulatory pressure, particularly if their headquarters were in Europe, to some extent in the US. There was increasing internal staff expectation for action. In some cases, there was a shareholder desire for sustainability proposition-driven growth. In other cases, there was a fear of reputational damage for the brand and actually for their own careers. There was a rising consumer demand that some perceived and were tracking. And there's a threat from sustainably purposed disruptor brands coming in and taking market share, and a personal sense of responsibility to make a positive contribution. And then the way that we summarize the sort of the key findings across all the areas, and Nick's already covered sort of 2 of these points, that there's a really sort of clear recognition and acceptance amongst the brand leaders that there is a new normal coming into view on the horizon, that they recognize that ultimately sustainability will no longer be a differentiating factor, but the new normal. And there's mounting pressure from multiple angles, but they consider themselves on a journey towards that. And it's It's about how fast and how they move towards it. And they do see that many of them see that as an opportunity as much as a threat, to gain rather than lose competitive advantage. And then on the consumer side, there is too this narrative of journeys intertwined with brands, intertwined with the other factors on society, and hence that they are being influenced and can be more and more engaged by brands that will impinge on their actions and increasingly influence their behavior. And then finally, we felt that the lens or the concept that really sort of brought this all together is this idea of shared value. That if all brands could realize that they were in the business of creating shared value between all of their stakeholders, not least the investors and the shareholders, but also their customers and society broadly, that would be the kind of the North Star that would keep them innovating in the right way in order to become leaders in their space or innovate in the right direction. And so with that, we'll thank you very much for your attention, and we'll hand back to Swint. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Nick. I really, I felt a sense of, oh, there's myself in the data when on the graph that talked about people of moderate engagement in terms of sustainability, because recently my sandals broke and I went to have them repaired, not completely because I was doing this for the point of sustainability, but because I really liked those sandals, just like that guy really liked his coat. And I think that that shows, as we think about sustainability, it will be motivated for different consumers and different consumer groups and subgroups in different ways. There's a lot in your report and a lot in your presentation this evening. A lot for us to think about in terms of the way we should act as corporations, the way we should act as consumers, and what we can demand from corporations and the government and ourselves. So I thank you very much for taking the time to share your research with us. We want at TUJ to be kind of the platform for these robust discussions. And we have them on in real time. Most months of the year, we're going to take August off. But I really will look forward to your participation in the future. And in the meantime, I posted a link to our LinkedIn roundtable group. And so we can continue this discussion there. But right now, I'd like to hand it over to Nick and James to see if they have any concluding remarks or promos or or things they want to leave us with.
I'd like to share a story. We were talking to a client recently who said, right now we're awake. We've realized that there are serious issues. We've got to do something about it. And that's, I think, the state that we're all at right now. We've realized that there's a real call to action. And for both brands and consumers whose journeys are intertwined, as we said, the important thing now is to move quickly. And if you do move quickly, there's still a chance to, from a brand's point of view, to gain a competitive advantage through sustainability. Thank
you, Nick. James, the last word to you.
Two last words. First one, thanks so much for everyone's participation. It definitely was a robust discussion, and it's been really interesting and gratifying for us to have that. And thanks, Swint, to you and your team for setting it up. It's been really great experience. I thought there was a really interesting point made about well, in my mind, it connected it to risk, and the fact that I think one of the things that we're all going to have to judge as professionals and as consumers and as parents is how risks change. There might be things that we are really, let's say, picky over when it comes to a particular category. But then if that brand that you like most is contributing to climate change, which means that wildfires are spreading throughout where you live, and that means that your house might burn down, it might get you thinking about how your judgment criteria. And this is we were talking to Eric Kawabata about TerraCycle about how we're likely to see change in the packaging regulation in Japan, and risks around food health safety compared to the impact of the plastic waste on the planet that's threatening all life on Earth. So that, I think there's some really big fundamental questions. We're going to have to be really holding ourselves and each other to account on communities like this to have the right principles and values being applied. And if you look at individual companies doing that, they're going to have to be being extremely competent in lots of areas that they've never really had to focus on, and that's going to be a really big challenge. But I think what's come through loud and clear from this group, and I think it's been a good reminder to me, is that that has, for the vast majority of consumers today in Japan, you're going to have to make it really simple. They're not going to be able to, it can't be complex. There needs to be really tangible takeaways, tangible rewards for them shifting their behavior one small step at a time. So that was a really good reminder. Thanks to everyone who reinforced that point and all the other ones. And thank you. I'll shout out to Professor Allison, who's spent his retirement from being a nuclear physicist, trying to help people adjust their perception of risk in the energy market. Hats off to you, sir, for doing more work than anyone for the benefit of your grandchildren and society at large. Thanks again, Sven, and to all of you.
Wonderful. I couldn't have said it better myself. These are important issues that we need to look at from various perspectives, and that's what we're trying to accomplish here at the Sustainability Roundtable. We'll send out an announcement for our next event, which will be in late September. In the meantime, enjoy your vacation, your summertime sustainably. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.